First, I want to start by saying this is truly a day of mourning. When we consider what's going on in Islamic regimes, there is one thing we need as we stand here to also be very thankful for, that we have a free country, that we could stand up in unison here together and mourn people in these regimes that do not have the freedom to come out in the open as we do here today and speak and think on their behalf. My only regret is that I would have liked to have seen a lot many churches out here today in support of this event. An extensive 54-page report for the London-based Savisit Institute that meticulously documented persecution country by country found that Christians are suffering more persecution around the world than any other religious group because of Islamic oppression. The report also referred to a blind spot by Western leaders and politicians to deal with the issue because of fear about being dubbed racists. We all know that racism is definitely an evil, but turning a blind eye to the truth about heinous persecution is no less evil. Although persecution happens in non-Islamic countries too, it is far more rampant in Islamic states globally and spreading rapidly, with the goal in many large regions to completely obliterate Christianity. Christians are being killed wholesale in Islamic states. A quick overview of some of those states. Egypt. Before Mohammed Morsi was elected, we were all given the bill of goods that this was a moderate Muslim. Well, as it turns out, he ended up being a leader and true to the Muslim Brotherhood and the tenets of the Muslim Brotherhood, and now it is unprecedented. That's how it's being described, as unprecedented, the way Christians are now living in fear in that country and are starting to leave in large numbers. Coptic Christian girls are being bullied to wear head coverings and harassed in the streets for not doing so. In April, Egyptian police officers stood by and watched as Muslim protesters fired guns, wielded machetes, and threw stones at Christians during a Coptic funeral, as coffins were being carried out of a funeral service at Cairo's St. Mark's Cathedral for 4 victims of an attack on Copts. 2 ended up dead, 89 ended up injured, and the protesters burned a Holy Bible. One only needs to read the news to find out what the fallout was when Terry Jones burned a Quran and threatened to do more of that. Now, I do not advocate the burning of anybody's holy book, but at the same time, why is it that the burnings of Bibles are tolerated globally? Looking over to Pakistan, Christians continue to be terrorized by blasphemy laws. Asia Bibi, I hope we all remember her because she's still on death row, sitting since 2009. She was confined to a tiny, tiny cell where she sat in the most disgusting, inhumane conditions. Smelly, she could barely breathe, and yet she sat there day after day fasting and praying. She was detained, and here's why she was detained: for breaking the blasphemy law. In fact, she was working out in the field with Muslim co-workers, and she was deemed to be saying something that she should not have against Muhammad and against the religion of Islam, when in fact, it has gone down that she was actually only trying to, there are 2 accounts of this. She was either trying to drink from the same cup as a Muslim, this is what some reports say, but because she's considered dirty, a dirty Christian, they ganged up on her. And the other report was that she was simply bringing water for her co-workers, and still she was not deemed worthy enough to do that. Hence, an argument ensued and she was detained. Recall the shocking case of Rimsha Messiah, who was falsely accused of blasphemy. This young girl created an international furor when she was taken aside, put in custody because of trumped-up charges, as it later came out, that it was a Muslim cleric that framed her on those charges. Well, she was released because of international pressure, and still, she and her family live in basic hiding and fear from subsequent attacks. Not far from where Rimsha lives, at that Christmas time and beyond that, a Muslim mob attacked Christian worshippers on Christmas Day, as we all know, this is a time, Christmas, where attacks are escalated on Christians during worship time. And in broad daylight, worshipers, which included children and women, were attacked by Muslims brandishing automatic rifles, iron rods, and pistols. And as Christians ran for their lives with their children in tow, there were several injuries before police finally decided to show up on the scene. Also in Pakistan, abductions of Christian girls, forced conversions, and marriage to older men are happening in the tune of 700 girls per year. Similar in Egypt, by the way, with 500 since 2011, when the revolution started. Under Pakistan's blasphemy laws, not even children are exempt from triggering this kind of a rage against them of being accused with blasphemy. Children there, according to World Watch Monitor, they have to carefully be educated by their parents on how to avoid triggering any kind of an accusation whatsoever that would insult Muhammad or insult the religion, even if they're questioned by other Muslims about their faith and about their thoughts about the Quran. They have to be careful and learn how to avoid being implicated under Pakistan's blasphemy laws. And they often become social loners because of this. In Iraq, one of the most tragic countries for Christians in the Middle East due to its rapid rate of descent, where Mosul and Baghdad are among the most violent cities, Christians and other minority groups are targeted indiscriminately, and thousands continue their exodus out of the country. The president of Open Doors USA, Carl Moeller, describes the attacks against Christians in Mosul as a religicide. Iran, meanwhile, well, everybody knows about that country. They continue their crackdowns on home churches and the hauling off to jail of Christians and of Muslims who convert to Christianity, who are sentenced to death. I'm going to get back to Iran shortly because Meir said some very important things in his speech. But first, let's move on to Syria. What happened in Iraq is said to now be emerging in Syria. We think about the recent news that Meir talked about the savage rebel Syrian brigade commander actually cutting out the heart and taking a bite out of it of the civilian soldier. But back on December 31st, a Syrian rebel beheaded a 38-year-old Christian father-to-be and fed his body to the dogs. Christian and Western officials have reported for some time now that Al-Qaeda militants have joined the main opposition force, the Free Syrian Army. Conditions are horrible for Christians living there. Tens of thousands have fled that country, but now the situation is such that barricades have been set up where they can't even leave anymore because of the roadblocks and the armed groups, mostly militiamen from the Al-Nusra Front. Moving over to the Middle East, this was touched on by Tony Costa. The stats are disappearing there when it comes to the Christian population, and it's striking. A century ago, 20% of the Middle East population was Christian. Today, 5%. In Bethlehem in 1948, 80% Christian. It's now 80% Muslim and less than 2% Christian. The Middle East is the cradle of Christian faith. There are those, and it's rooted in the Old Testament, even though there are those that will tell you it was European colonialism that spread the faith. It has been rooted a long time ago in the Middle East. The only place that Christians are actually welcomed in the Middle East, and gays, is Israel. And that state is a persecuted state. It is a persecuted state. The PA Charter, the Hamas Charter, the Fatah Charter all call for the obliteration of Israel. During World War II, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, he worked alongside with Hitler to destroy the Jews. In fact, when Hitler at one point said, let's get the children out of Germany, just get them out, transport them out, he said, no, put them and their families in the gas chamber. A lot of people don't even know to this day that Yasser Arafat was a blood relative of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, so he is an al-Husseini. Going back to Israel, and this is not something that I'm going to elaborate on because it stems from a speech that I moderated this week by Edwin Black, who spoke on the topic, Inside Iran's Atomic Warhead. And he talked about the level of threat. Well, it's crossed that red line, according to his reports, and according to reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency. We hear words like when it gets up to 20% uranium enrichment, that means that we're in trouble. Well, we are in trouble because 20% enrichment translates to 90% toward building an atomic warhead. And he gave us an idea of what that might look like. If that bomb, that atomic warhead, was ever released, it does not detonate on the ground, but in the air. And if it ends up detonating above Tel Aviv, the span of it will be an 8-mile radius with the fallout far beyond that. People ask questions, why is it that the world stands by and what are they waiting for? Well, it's because the world appreciates, and the West, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and international law that states that civilians must not be bombed. And this is what is keeping it, because we know that these states hide their bombs well among civilians because they too know those laws. We in the West, by the way, we're not immune from persecution. In fact, we're already seeing it through what many of you may have heard of. It's called Islamic lawfare, where people like Mark Harding, he'll tell you about it if you go back and read some of his history, where people like Ezra Levant, even Blazing Cat Fur experienced it, Mark Stein, where they're taken to the full length of the law and well, the shakedown, if any of you have read that book, Ezra Levant's book Shakedown, because of the clever use of Islamic lawfare, using our own democracy and our own system against us. Intimidation, where those who fight for our democratic freedoms are banned from speaking in places. We're allowed hate fests in our society, like the Al-Quds rallies, extremist messages upon our campuses, and in many of the mosques. Why? Because of a global agenda, not only to wipe out Christianity in many regions, but also to penetrate the backbone of our democracy, our free speech. What other states in the world do you know that's governed by a religious regime that declares global laws that make religion immune to criticism, or which seeks to wipe Christianity out of major global regions and to wipe a nation off the face of the map? Given the plight of Christians and those persecuted in Islamic regimes, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation that has hijacked the United Nations vigorously endeavors to enforce defamation of Islam laws globally. Watch out for Resolution 1618. And the OIC Secretary General, who is from Turkey, has just insisted that there must be a seat allocated for the OIC in the United Nations Security Council, while the Turkish Prime Minister Recep Erdogan is pushing for defamation of Islam to be considered a crime against humanity. In the face of all these crimes against people that are persecuted in Islamic states, against humanity, and the creation of the morbid human carnage that we're seeing, he has the audacity to push for defamation of Islam to be considered a crime against humanity. Back to that study I referred to by the British organization Civitas, which concludes in its report entitled Christianophobia, that Christians are suffering more persecution around the world than any other religious group because of Islamic oppression. It refers to a blind spot in the report and cites evidence that the goal of Islamists is to create an African Islamic continent where Christians must be killed or expelled. In Africa, from Nigeria to Sudan, the war of religion is raging in a gruesome genocide that includes machete attacks and live burnings. Speaking of Sudan, who could forget the terrible genocide that killed 400,000 people and displaced some 3 million, still in the Nuba Mountains? In the Nubud Mountains, the Khartoum government continues blanket aerial bombings on Christians and the prevention of aid. Many aid organizations are now wondering why this is ignored, a very valid question, and that is threatening to become, right under our noses, another Darfur. Over 13,750 Christians have been killed by Muslims in northern Nigeria alone since the introduction of Sharia law in 2001. In March of this year, 112 Christians were reportedly slaughtered just for being Christians. According to persecution watchdog Open Doors, 5 million more Christians in the north are living under severe repression. The West is considered to be blind as it tries to atone, according to this report, for its, quote, colonial past, while the Islamic militant group Boko Haram aims to eliminate Christians from the north. As for Somalia, Al-Shabaab, with yes ties to Al-Qaeda terrorists, have vowed to rid Somalia of Christians also, who now are meeting underground because of the severity of persecution. I would like us to all reflect on that question, why the blind spot? I'm going to refer to a quote that was actually delivered by Rand Paul only because it was just delivered in mid-June at the Faith and Freedom Conference. He called on the U.S. government, and we all should be calling on our governments to stop sending foreign aid to nations that persecute Christians. Quote, he said, "It angers me to see my tax dollars supporting regimes that put Christians to death for blasphemy against Islam, countries that put to death Muslims who convert to Christianity, and countries who imprison anyone who marries outside the religion." Well, it should anger all of us. My final question, what happened to the UN Declaration of Human Rights that states in its articles that everyone has the right to liberty, to life, and security of person? Now, Tony outlined some of this in his speech earlier on. No one should be held in slavery or servitude, all the while Arabs are still holding black slaves in Mauritania and beyond. No one should be subject to torture and or cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment, according to another article, and that everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. All are equal under the law and equal rights to marriage of men and women. But the Turkish leader Erdogan wants defamation of Islam to be a crime against humanity, and our Western leaders are too much buying into it. Thank you all who came out today.